How's it going, everybody? This is episode 2 of our show, The Nitty Gritty. My name is Chad. With me is Leonard. We are wrestling fans. Leonard is still a writer. I used to write for a site, 411, as did Leonard. Now we are just talking to you as wrestling fans. And this is going to be our first show, and probably a recurring thing that we come back to every now and then, about some of the lesser-known superstars out there, where we kind of cover their career. And a lot of times there will be short careers, as in the one we're talking about tonight. And, I don't know, what can we call this recurring series, Leonard? We could call it YouTubular version 2.0. Tell them why we could call it that.
Well, originally I had done a column on 411 Mania back when we both wrote for it, for the Wrestling Zone, called YouTubular. And it was where I would basically analyze and review matches from YouTube of various wrestlers who were jobber to mid-card guys, maybe weren't known on a national level for a long period of time. And the very first one I did was for Big Bully Busick. And that's why I wanted to do him tonight for this show, was I kind of fell down a Big Bully Busick rabbit hole on YouTube. And I don't remember how I did that. But as I'm watching, what?
It's easy to fall down a Big Bully Busick rabbit hole.
Yes.
I feel like, anyway.
Just about all, if not all, almost all of his WWF run, as brief as it was, is available on YouTube. And I was just thinking to myself, this was before the network, but they were putting out all these different DVD box sets. And I was just thinking, if the WWE wanted to, they could take all the Big Bully Busick footage they had, they could slap together a 15 and 20-minute documentary, make a DVD out of it, sell it for $9.99, and guys like me and Chad would buy the crap out of it. So it was me kind of doing a Big Bully Busick and other talent box sets, as it were, in this column. And a story that we will save for the end is I have a Big Bully Busick story connected to that column. But I think we will close with that story.
Right. And you know what? As cool as, DVD releases of some of the lesser known people would be, and absolutely people like you and I would absolutely buy them up. I don't know how long a list of people would go out and buy these DVDs, especially since Billy Graham, superstar Billy Graham, I think he only got one disc. So
yeah, and I have that and I love it. And yeah.
So if he only got one disc, Big Bully Busick, might be an extra on somebody else's disc.
Right. Maybe it can be just a disc of great mustaches.
Yeah, you know what? And we'll talk. He made that list, the WWE list. Yeah. I'm going to find that. They need to make that video somewhere. But as we've already said, our first episode in this series will be on Big Bully Busick, and we are going to talk to you a little bit about him. He was born June 1st, 1954. He was an amateur wrestler in high school and became a very well-known power lifter, and he continued to do that until 2015, into the twilight of his life. He grew up with Bruno Sammartino as his hero in wrestling, and how he got into the business was one day Mike Padusis gave him a 1-week pro wrestling training course. His first match was for the WWF on May 12th, 1978, and he would kind of start over the next 2 years as being basically a jobber. Apparently he won once or twice, but anytime they came to the Pittsburgh area, he would get work, and that's where he was from. He was from the Pittsburgh area. He lived in Ohio, and when you hear or watch his matches from his mainstream run of WWF, he would be called from Weirton, West Virginia. But he grew up around the Pittsburgh, Ohio area. And
that's all steel belt country.
Right.
I know that area well. It's all steel belt stuff.
And so, he kind of got out of wrestling after the initial WWF run. And in the 80s, he worked for the Atlanta Police Department. Criminal justice, law enforcement was always a big part of his life. And eventually in the late 80s, he would wrestle for Jerry Blackwell in Georgia All-Star Wrestling, also known as Southern Championship Wrestling, which was about from 88 to 91. And it was in this part of his wrestling career, he always kind of looked at it as like a side thing, and he, never quite gave it up around this time. But it was Joe Pedicino who suggested the bully persona. And he based that on what Leonard talked about, like steel country. He based it on a steel worker or a coal miner. You had the derby hat, and I don't know if he had the tight shirt when he was in Jerry Blackwell's promotion, but that's how they kind of started that whole gimmick. and he obviously had the great facial hair. And he would continue that character, obviously, until he got to the WWF with Harvey Whippleman as his manager in July of '91. So, Leonard, when did you first learn of Big Bully Busick?
He's one of those guys that I think I remembered in hindsight, like years later when something came up about him where the name was said or a picture popped up online. I went, oh, yeah, I remember that guy. And I think it's because even though he had a very short career in WWF, he had such a memorable look and a memorable character. We already mentioned some of it. He had the derby hat. He had this just gigantic, very memorable looking mustache. He had a cigar. He had this tight red sweater or shirt on. And I sent Chad a clip of a Looney Tunes cartoon of Chester and Spike. And the big bulldog is dressed exactly like Busick would dress in his early promos with the red shirt and everything.
Absolutely. And everybody, if you don't know what clip Leonard's talking about with Chester and Spike, I guarantee if you're around our age, you know what cartoon clip we're talking about. The little dog is kind of jumping around the bigger dog, yes, saying, "What are you doing, Spike? Where are you going, Spike?" That kind of thing. I'm sure everybody knows what we're talking about, but it is literally, it looks, uncannily like Big Bully Busick and Harvey Whippleman. Yeah. Which is funny.
Yeah, with Whippleman in front of him, aka Downtown Bruno for the old school Memphis fans that might be watching. So that was he was one of those in hindsight guys, but I think he is so memorable because of his look, and the look also extends to his physicality as well. I think one element of it is the fact that he has a look of like a 1920s bully or strongman, or even, as you mentioned, an old school coal miner or steel mill worker. He was probably stronger than, say, a guy like Hulk Hogan, but he didn't have the definition of Hulk Hogan. He didn't look like Hulk Hogan. And I think it was because of that old school look. And I believe I remember reading that it was because of that old school look that the bully character kind of developed too. He looked like it, he could act like it. And that's where that came from. And it's just super memorable, even though his run was approximately 4 months on the national scene.
Yeah. And, he did have that kind of barrel chest look. He was obviously a very big guy, and the mustache, the facial hair, very easily fit into the persona of a bully. And, we were talking before that, his facial hair initially, went around almost like a Burnside mustache, but kind of went around and almost stopped back here. And like, it was even more epic then, but eventually they just kind of cut it off, and it was just like the big bushy Wilford Brimley mustache. Mm-hmm. But he would definitely be in the category of best mustaches. I think he would definitely be number one for me. Talent aside, accomplishments in the ring aside.
If the WWF Hall of Fame had a mustache wing, I think he's a first ballot Hall of Famer, easy.
Absolutely. And, he did kind of, have, even though they modeled it after somebody, in kind of a coal miner or steel worker type thing, he did have that sort of also 1920s bully look, where they kind of put both fists up like this, that kind of thing. Right. Mm-hmm. And he it was a cool looking character, and he would squash jobbers for a while. Initially, I think they being Vince, pronouns pal, they would give him, they wanted to give him like a strong lead in. He would squash jobbers, which is what every debuting heel guy would do back then, would be to squash jobbers. And, they eventually had a segment where he would harass announcer Mike McGurk, which is the daughter of Leroy McGurk. And if you don't know who that is, I'm sure you might not know the name, but if you go back to some of the shows from the 80s, you would probably know her voice. When the Fink was off, she would usually be the one doing it. So you definitely, we'll post a picture of her for this.
Very underrated. I always enjoyed Mike McGurk's work, and I loved her outfit as well. It was like this pink tuxedo number usually. I don't know if I would use the word sexy for it, but it was certainly striking. And again, thought she was very underrated.
Right. No, absolutely. I agree. And that whole thing, they were, kind of chasing her around, not chasing, but they were kind of cornering her around the ring. And, You
They
know,
were bullying her,
yeah,
as it might be.
of course, they were doing a good job of living up to their character of bullying, and they would blow cigar smoke in her face and just making her feel uncomfortable. This led to Sid Justice coming out and quickly beating down Big Bully Busick in really short order, powerbomb, end of story. And why that happened, and we'll get to some of the other matches that Big Bully Busick had, but why that happened, Sid did do a shoot interview. I'm not sure how many he's done, but he did do one where he talked about Big Bully Busick and basically how his run how his whole, look got soured with Vince was he apparently went out drinking with Jim Neidhart. I can only imagine what that night of drinking was like.
I also have a drinking with Jim Neidhart story.
There you
That
go.
will not be told on this episode, but if you're really good out there and you ask for it, maybe we'll tell it in the future.
That's the A. And you know what? If Leonard has a drinking with Jim Neidhart story, imagine how many people do. But so yeah, he went out drinking with Jim Neidhart and apparently showed up late the next day, and that will never score you points in any job, especially with Vince though. And apparently also he wouldn't do one of the parts to his gimmick, which was to, take the cigar and pop the balloon of a kid in the audience. And, I think he did it once, maybe more than that. There was a clip, around at some point. I was not able to dig it up. If we can dig it up before the show, I'll post it. But he wouldn't do that. And when you have somebody who has maybe had a drinking issue, or at least a small part of one, it makes you late for work. You're not putting all of your heart into the heel persona of the character, because any interview you hear with Nick Busick, he seems like a genuinely good guy. And, if you look at somebody like the $1 Million Man who had no issue, really going 110% with the heel part of his gimmick, those types of things will not make your run last long. And as Leonard said earlier, his run lasted only 4 months, which is unfortunate. November of '91. What do you think, Leonard? Do you think he should have gotten a longer run, or do you think it was kind of destined to be this short?
Well, I think I think how long would that run have been? Given the character that we've talked about in depth here, I think if he would have came around a little bit earlier, like the Rock and Wrestling era, I think he might have more of a little bit of a longer career. I could totally see him on the Hulk Hogan cartoon as being a heel there. Or if he came along a few years later during the New Generation era where everybody had a day job, that gimmick fits a little bit more too. So I think it was timing. I think he just came in at a time where they weren't quite sure what they were doing and business was down a little bit. As you mentioned earlier, they seem to do this with a lot of heels. They would bring them in, give them, 4 or 5 weeks of jobbers to squash on TV, and then they would get squashed themselves. The Repo Man immediately comes to mind, even though he had a little more longevity to him. But with Busick, I think he had certainly the look and the talent to go further. Now, I don't know how much further. Would he have gotten beyond IC title level? I don't think so. But I think he could have been a foil for your face IC champ from time to time, depending on who that might have been. I don't believe it was mentioned he did have a very short feud with the Brooklyn Brawler while he was in WWF. Which was over like who was the biggest bully, who was the biggest brawler, who was the biggest fighter type of thing. It was kind of a heel versus heel feud, which you didn't see much of. So I think there was certainly potential for a longer career. Now, how high that ceiling was, I don't think it was much higher than where he was at. But he certainly could have been a decent hand in the ring and an enhancement talent to get over your baby faces, a jobber to the stars, as they call it, I think for, a longer period of time than he was.
That would have been a bigger, it would have been I think what I was going to say is his biggest win was probably against the Brooklyn Brawler.
Mm-hmm.
And it was like sort of a controversial, screw job type finish. But he did have, some pretty good, I don't want to say good, but maybe matches with really good talent. I know that in the interview that he did, his shoot interview, he talked about his wrestling career peak was against Kerry Von Erich at Madison Square Garden. And, he lost that match, but, he said at that time he knew his contract was due. He knew he wasn't doing what they wanted. And, in his shoot interview, as I talked about why he left, he did admit that he wasn't giving Vince what he wanted in the heel persona. He didn't mention anything about the drinking, but he did mention that they kind of wanted a more brash, aggressive bully character. He, in the interview, compared it to Stone Cold. That's not my comparison, but it's interesting in that era that Vince was looking even then for somebody who was a little bit more like Stone Cold. And I think, though, with his gimmick being the 20s bully steelworker type look, I don't know how they would have gotten there with somebody like him. Obviously, it would take many more years before they would find their ideal match in Stone Cold. But to go on what you were saying, I think that if you had him there a few years earlier, I think he would have been a great foil for Hogan on like the house show circuit.
Oh, yeah.
Maybe having like a high profile match on like a Saturday Night's Main Event or something like that. He totally fits that mold. But unfortunately, it was never to be. He also had losses to Hacksaw Jim Duggan. He lost to Jim Neidhart, and he did a submission loss to Bret Hart. And he talked about it in his interview in that match that he had screwed up during that match, and he apologized to Bret in the back. And there's screw-ups and everything. But we've heard through other podcasts, interviews, stories, news articles that sometimes you don't get many chances to make a great impression when you're really green. And when you screw up in a match against a veteran like Bret Hart, and then you're late and you don't want to do what's required of the character, it was just kind of, a recipe for, ending his run, unfortunately. And he also had a DQ loss to the British Bulldogs. So he worked with some high name talent, right?
Yeah, and I've watched some of those getting ready for the show, today, and particularly the Kerry Von Erich match. I would agree with him. I thought that was one of his better matches, and the Duggan match too. Duggan doesn't get a lot of credit for his WWF work because he was more of a caricature than he was back in Mid-South, but that was a good match too. And I think one thing to mention, if you compare the styles of Duggan, of Bret Hart, of Jim Neidhart, of Kerry Von Erich, they're all different styles.
Yeah.
He was able to work with all of them. And also the idea, too, that he had a very specific style of wrestling, especially when you watch his early matches against the Jobbers and the way that he just roughhoused these guys.
Right.
I don't remember the guy he was wrestling the one match I saw, but it was basically just him whipping the guy as hard as he could into the near corner. And then the guy would bounce out and he'd grab him and he'd whip him again as hard as he could. And we haven't talked about it yet, but since Busick did win some matches, he did have a finisher.
Which is a great finisher that needs to be brought back. It is called the stump puller. I don't know if Busick ever referred to it that way, but in one of his early matches against a jobber, Gorilla Monsoon is quoted as saying, I don't know what he calls it, but that's the old stump puller. And we will post a picture of that here. And it is a really, it does look painful, at least to me. And he would say in his interview that was a shoot. He would really put that on people because it's hard to fake a move like that. And, he would say throughout his career, he worked stiff. And, but yeah, if you watch that move, I don't know why that hasn't been brought back, because you could put that on anybody. You really if you have the right guy, you could put that move on anybody.
Yeah, definitely. I think that's a move for either a big burly guy like Busick was, or maybe someone who's working like an old school tech gimmick, like I'm an old school technical wrestler type of guy. If he had come along during the Attitude Era, that move would all been about the fact that he has his butt shoved in a guy's face.
Yeah.
But back when they did it, it was more about how this was a painful old school move. And it's a really unique move. You know, our first show we talked about underused moves, and it's how a lot of moves just kind of fell out of favor. People don't do them anymore. And the stump puller is one of those. And again, as I said on that episode, you can get anything over if you do it right, you work it right, you educate the fans on it. And so, yeah, I think the stump puller is probably nothing we're ever going to see again, but never say never in wrestling, because you never know who might pull that out for whatever reasons.
That's true. And, you know, what's interesting, if you go back and watch some of his matches with some of the guys we mentioned, like Hacksaw Jim Duggan, like it was one of the only times I can remember Hacksaw Jim Duggan winning a match with 3-point stance. And, you know, Kerry Von Erich won with his tornado punch. And it was great to see these guys win with their finishers just clean in the middle like that, because I feel like poor Hacksaw never, I mean, he would always go down for that 3-point stance, but it was rare that he actually won and used it in a match and won the match, you know, with it.
Yeah, and with Kerry too in that match, I thought Busick sold the punch great. If you would go back and watch that, because that was a move too that they only gave it to him because it involved him spinning like a tornado.
Right.
And you know, he did the claw in WWF, but he didn't do it as much. They wanted to get that tornado punch over. And I think Busick did a great sell job in the match that I watched of that.
Absolutely. Well, his last match was in 1992. After wrestling, he became a partner with Bill Eadie, who was a member of Demolition. And they had an executive security / bodyguard company. And he, like I said, before he worked a lot in law enforcement, even after his wrestling career. And he started a Big Bully sports bar nutrition company. I would have loved to have tried one of his sports bars. That would have been cool. And he helped train some MMA fighters. He even said in his interview that I heard that he would have totally done MMA if it had been a thing back then. Because he obviously had powerlifting experience and amateur wrestling experience, so it would have been interesting to see if he had gone that route. I think in the interview they kind of compared Dan Severn to him, which is interesting. He's spoken out against bullies, which is cool to me based on his gimmick. That, you know, and by the way, he was able to keep the name Big Bully Busick because he had it before WWF. So that is historically how these guys are able to keep their names, if they can show and prove that they used it before. And unfortunately, well, you know what? Let's not get to the end of his life yet. This is the perfect time to mention Leonard's story. So, Leonard,
yes,
tell everybody your very cool Big Bully Busick story.
So, as mentioned earlier, the first YouTuber column I wrote was on Big Bully Busick, and Busick wrote me. He read it. He liked it. Of course I threw some humor in there. He enjoyed the humor of it. And originally we talked about doing an interview with him for 411. He talked about wanting to work with me on an article that we could shop around to some of the wrestling magazines. And then it got to the point where he wanted to have me ghostwrite his autobiography. And this was around March of 2009. I still have some of the emails that we traded back and forth. I found those before doing this video because I wanted to see if I still had them or about what the time period was. And that included him giving me a lot of bullet points, a lot of chapter ideas. One that he was really big upon that he wanted to talk about was the fact that he had I don't remember if it was an actual heart attack or some sort of heart issue while working out. He was on a treadmill and died. He was literally dead for, I forget the amount of time before being brought back. But he really wanted to talk about that. He really wanted to talk about the anti-bullying.
You know what, Leonard, let me just interject here really quick, because what you mentioned just about the heart attack is interesting, because he had talked about in his interview that he would often blow up in the ring really quickly. If you watch any of his matches, I think the longest match that he has is with British Bulldog. And he would blow up really easily because he had that heart condition. So unfortunately, health issues plagued him a lot in his life. But go ahead.
Yeah, so the health element he wanted to talk about, the anti-bullying that you mentioned earlier, he wanted to talk about. And the last chapter, he wanted to be about his son, Bronk Busick, who at the time was playing football for the University of West Virginia and who now is an MMA fighter.
Great name.
You mentioned the MMA connection earlier.
You don't need any gimmick name there.
Yes, yeah. So he lived in Steubenville, Ohio, which isn't too far from me. And I was arranging to go visit him for a long weekend and basically record interviews, record conversations, and work on the book from there. I had take some extra time off from work. I booked a hotel room, and it was about a week and a half, 2 weeks out. I was trying to get with him via email. I never had a phone number. We just corresponded via email on, when did you want to meet? Where did you want to meet? Do you want to come to the hotel? You want to come to you? Do you want to, go get lunch to meet first? What have you? And he never wrote me back. So I got ghosted by Big Bully Busick on ghost writing his autobiography. So the last email I sent him was like the Thursday before that Friday I was going up. I said, hey, I haven't heard from you. I'm going to cancel. I'm not going to come up. But if you change your mind, if you want to do this again, just get a hold of me. I never heard from him again. No hard feelings on there. It was a very cool experience to exchange emails with him. It's a great story that I get to tell now, that I get to tell all of you out there in internet land here. And, because of that, it's another reason why I wanted to start off with him. And he'll always have a special place in my heart and my fandom because of that personal connection I had with him.
And that's a very cool story. And he did really seem like a cool guy. It would have been cool if he was, still with us and able to go to some of the wrestling conventions when the wrestling conventions and movie conventions were still going on, that is. Can you imagine if you had actually written that? I mean, you wouldn't, you might not be here right now, doing this show. You would be, if I asked you to do it, you'd be like, hey, I'm writing, Iron Mike Sharp.
Mantar. Yeah. Me and Barry Horowitz are meeting on Thursday. We got to get this pounded out,
Yeah. But no, that's a very cool story. It would have been cool if that actually happened, but it is cool to just say you had the experience, and got to know him at least a little bit through email anyway, right?
Yeah. And again, a lot of the stuff that you talked about, pulled from various sources, was things that he talked about with me as well, things he wanted to be part of the book.
Right. And, as I had mentioned, the latter part of his life, unfortunately, he did have a lot of health problems. He did have heart problems. So he did have that sudden death cardiac arrest that Leonard mentioned. And he also got esophageal cancer. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right, but he did have throat cancer, and he eventually beat that. He became cancer-free. And you can find a news clip of him, describing that and seeing his workouts and stuff online. And unfortunately, though, what ended up, how he lost his life was because of a brain tumor. But you know what? It's cool that we get to come back and talk about some of these guys. And, he did have a very memorable character. And, I don't know what it is about, cool mustaches in the 80s, but he really did have a memorable look to him. And, he did make a couple of WWE lists. We talked about best mustache on the top 10 mustaches in WWE history. If anybody knows if that's just an article, it'd be cool if they, like, the WWE has their top 10 on YouTube.
Yeah.
Those short little videos, which I love watching. So it would be cool. If that's one, I'm definitely going to try and dig it up. But he also made number 17 out of 25 of the most absurd wrestlers in WWE history, which I feel like, and we talked about this before, but I feel like that's not really one that should be on that list, considering some of the crazy gimmicks.
No, I'd have to see the whole list and also figure out my own personal list on that. But I just think it was a different gimmick, and it's a gimmick that I don't think anyone else ever used before. So in that regard, you may consider it absurd, but I think it was just different, but in that way memorable, because I think anyone around our age that was watching wrestling at the time, they're going to remember him. There might be people, I guarantee you there's going to be people who are just going to see the headline of this video that says Big Bully Busick and go, oh yeah,
Right.
just light up, and that light bulb's going to click. Like, that's a guy I haven't thought about in 20, 25 years.
Well, and I hope people do that too.
Yes.
We didn't talk about this yet, but before this, and I remember your articles at 411, but before we, suggested this topic and you mentioned his name, like I didn't, around this time was when I was really starting to kind of dip my fandom of wrestling a little bit. I obviously grew up, a big fan of Hulk Hogan. And, once that started to wane a little bit, I would check in and out, depending on what he was doing. But around the time that Big Bully Busick was there, I wasn't watching every week, but so he was like, I really got to know his character for this show. And I certainly didn't remember the stump puller before this. I don't remember. I never heard of that move before watching YouTube videos about Big Bully Busick. So, it was cool to do this. And do you have any final thoughts on Big Bully Busick before we wrap this up?
Well, from what you just mentioned, I watched a little bit past your point. I think it was around 95-ish that I kind of got out of it until I got back into college in the Attitude Era, and all my buddies was watching it. So, again, like I said, I think Busick is a guy who certainly had a lot of potential. I think it was bad timing, and I think it was a lot of little things that even he himself in interviews admitted didn't work out for him. So instead of being a huge name guy that everyone still talks about today, he is a part of our new segment where we're going to be looking at some of the lesser known figures of the past, but doesn't mean they're bad and doesn't mean they don't deserve to be talked about, especially a guy like Nick Busick. That I'm glad with that. One, I could share my story about him, and that we could just maybe even educate some people on who he was.
That's right, absolutely. And one of the other notes that I had made was I thought he would have been cool in another era. Obviously, he would have been cool as like kind of a heater for FTR or the Revival. I think he would have fit in. If you watch, you see Tully with them now, and you see Arn with Cody. It would have been cool to see an elderly Big Bully Busick who still had that mustache well into old age. It would have been cool to see him, and who continued powerlifting until 2015. It would have been cool to see him with them, but unfortunately, it wasn't to be. It was cool to talk about this, and thank you for joining us on this episode of the Nitty Gritty. And please join us next week, where we're going to be talking about how we keep up with the current product. Thank you very much. And my name is Chad and Leonard. We will see you next time. Bye-bye.